We are now leaving the world of variables and dive into another new CSS concept: CSS transformations and transitions. Now, we'll first have a look at the theory here to see what these topics are all about, and then we'll implement these new concepts into our existing project. So, what are transformations and transitions? Well, a transformation is moving or changing the appearance of an element, for example, when hovering over it. An example in our project could be our card container here. So whenever we hover over this container, at the moment we have a default hover effect, changing the background color here, for example, of the button. But we could also say that if we hover over this entire container, so here or there or anywhere on this container, then it should increase its size by 10, 20, 30, whatever percent. This could be achieved via a so-called transformation. Besides the transformation, we also have the transition though. The transition then makes sure that we have a smooth transition from the initial, so the initial size of our card container in our case, to the transformed state, so to the bigger card size, so to say. From a code perspective, we'll first have a look at how we can implement a transformation, so for example this size increase, and then as step 2 we'll dive into transitions and how these can be connected to the actual transformation. From a code perspective, the transformation would look like this. Here we have the transform property, that's the property we need to implement such a transformation, and we would add this property to the state of the element that initiates the transformation, that triggers the event, so to say, which in our case would be hovering over the card container. This means in the hover pseudo-selector, we add the transform property, and then we have different values we can add to this transform property. In the example here, we added the scale value with a factor of 2 in parentheses. This simply means that the scale, so the size of this element, would double. So practically, this would mean you have the initial size, in this case of this book, and once you hover over this book, then the size would double. This can be achieved with this transform property. Let's have a look at this in practice now, and for this we go back to the project. And as I said, I want to double the size of the card container once we hover over it. Therefore, in our code, in our CSS file, we go down a bit below our card container class selector, because as I said, we won't add the transform property to the element itself, but to the state of the element that triggers the transformation. And in our case here, this transformation should occur once we hover over our card container, and therefore we have to go with our card container class once again, but now add the hover pseudo-selector. With this, we can now add the transform property. So as we saw it, we use transform in our colon. It's a normal property, just as any other properties we learned about in this course so far. But now here we could add the scale value, and there we could use a factor of 2, for example. As I said, this will double the size of the entire element. By saving this and going back to our project, and now hovering over the card, you see that if I zoom out a bit maybe to 100%, that yeah, this works, but this is way too big. Therefore, what we can do now is we can go back, and instead of this doubling, so instead of this 100% increase in size, we could just go for 1.10. So this would be a 10% size increase. Scale 1 would be, keep the existing size. 1.10 would be a 10% size increase. 1.20, 20%, and so on. So we'll go with 1.20 or 1.2, both is working of course. And with this in place, And by going back, you see that now this effect looks a lot better. But actually, it's still too big, so I'll actually go down even further to just a very slight change of maybe 5%. So let's add this value now. And by going back again, you see now this looks fine. By the way, transform is not limited to scale, of course. Attached to this lecture, you can find dedicated information about the transform property and which values you can apply. Just to give you one other example here, let's go back to the code once again. And instead of scale, we can delete this, we can now, for example, add the rotate value, this one here. And now we could add 180 DEG, so 180 degrees. And as you can imagine, with this in place, if we go back and hover over the card, well, it rotates by 180% once we hover over it. Not the effect we need for our project though, therefore let's go back and let's add our scale value once again. So we had scale of 1.05, I guess, so 5%. So let's go back. Yeah, now this looks good. So this is part one to make our page, well, a bit more fancy, so to say. But besides our transformation, we also saw this transitions concept on the slide. Let's explore transitions now as a next step.